All right, so thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here. I've been looking forward to this for a while, a full day on groin pain only, which is not something that you get a lot. So I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's a real honor to be here. So I'm a physiotherapist. I'm from Denmark, but currently I work as a clinical research scientist and a physio down in Aspetar. Perfect, I'll just go on from here. So currently I work in Aspetar. For those of you who do not know Aspetar, it's a sports medicine hospital in Qatar, an orthopedic and sports medicine hospital in Qatar. We also have an academy and a whole zone dedicated to sports. So we get athletes from all over the world, but mainly from the region. But a lot of French athletes are finding their way down here, either through training camps, just focusing on performance, or for individual assessments and treatments. So that's always an option for you to come by as well. Today I'll talk a little bit about prevention. I'll focus on the evidence, and I'm happy to discuss all the other options that we have in terms of prevention and providing a multimodal approach. But now we'll base my talk here on what available evidence that we have today. We can use an approach, an overview of this comprehensive model for injury prevention. So we need to know a little bit about how this pain develops or how this injury potentially occurs. So we start out with a player, healthy player, that's your team. And then we want to know, can we then identify any internal risk factors that may be predisposing this player to the development of groin pain? And this can be all kinds of demographic factors and so on. Then we want to figure out, is there anything related to the external load that will make this player more susceptible to groin pain? And then we can look a little bit closer to what is it actually that is happening that can be causing the pain, so the injury mechanisms. So we'll go through the evidence on these related to groin pain, hopefully. Yeah, so in 2015 was the latest systematic review looking at the internal risk, or looking at risk factors in general for the development of groin pain. And what we found is that there's actually not that many risk factors which have been shown to be associated with groin pain. The factors that are there is the previous groin injury, so that is consistent through most injuries. Higher level of play, so probably related to load as well. Low off-season sport-specific training, and low hip adductor strength. But maybe as interesting, we have a lot of elements which are also associated, or which have been shown not to be associated with groin pain. So these are the elements that you should likely not focus too much on. Okay, sorry. So if we plug these four risk factors into our model, we have the internal risk factors, which is previous groin injury. So how can we use that? We can't really modify that, but we can simply ask the question to the player, or we have our injury records. Has this player had problems before? Then he may be at a higher risk, or he's likely to be at a higher risk for developing groin pain again. But of the modifiable risk factors, we only have adductor strength to look at. Which is associated with an increased risk of groin pain. So we did a study in Qatar, it was mentioned earlier, with Andrea Mosler and her PhD, where they screened the whole Qatar Stars League, which is the best football league in Qatar with all professional clubs. And we did a squeeze test, so adductor squeeze test, eccentric sideline adduction strength, and abduction strength. And that enabled us to provide some normal values. So how do these players look? What is a strong player? What is a normal player? And what is a weak player or a very weak player? So we can categorize strength into that, these groups. And then the next step is then, of course, to look at, does it matter in relation to the development of groin pain? And we can see that we actually found that it did, but only for adductor-related groin pain. So we have a lot of different types of groin pain, and we try to group this according to the Doha entities, clinical entities. And when we looked at adductor-related groin pain, we can see that the group with low adductor strength had a higher risk of injury, so a hazard ratio of 1.7. So it goes through again, adductor strength and adductor-related groin pain. But when we look at it from a more individual base, we look at our group comparison, and we can see what does it matter, how can we use that on an individual basis when we're looking at your player in front of you. So you tested a player, and you figured out, does he have low strength or does he have high strength? And will he then be more susceptible to injury? What should I do differently with this player? And can I categorize him into one of these groups of potential injury or not? And we can see that there's a great overlap. If we first look at all hip and groin injuries in general, we can see that the group that got injured, the dark group here, actually had on average slightly higher adduction strength. And when we look at the two groups over here, we can see that even though that the uninjured had a bit higher strength, they weren't that different on a group basis. So wouldn't really feel comfortable of grouping this player to an uninjured group and doing an individual intervention for that. Sorry. So with these limited factors, we can say that these two elements are associated with a higher risk, but on an individual basis, we can probably not detect, or we cannot detect these individuals that are at higher risk. So we look next to our external risk factors. We have the higher level of play. We, of course, don't want to mess with that. We don't want to put the players at a lower level. And we can look at the off-season training. So there's a specific study looking at ice hockey players, so this is not related to football. And they actually takes quite a lot of off-season training. In this study, it was 6 weeks of 3 times per week during the off-season. And it's something that you rarely get in football, but it does tell you that you can't just send the players off. It likely makes a big difference what they do in their break as well in terms of getting back and having an injury in the beginning of the season. Here was during an ice hockey training camp. But then we get to the big question that's been mentioned here before as well, is the injury. When is it actually an injury? So before they get to the stage of injury, what happens? So the study that was mentioned before, when we're looking at all these Danish football players, if we asked them if they had any groin pain the last season, around half of them said that they had groin pain, and actually 30% of these had it for more than 6 weeks. So this is what we'll determine as long-standing groin pain. But only less than half actually missed a match. So we have all of these players, but the determination of injury is difficult. And we saw this graph before as well with the proportion of time loss injuries compared to non-time loss injuries. There's this study in Spanish football, and there's a similar study in Norwegian football where we're just asking 4 questions with the overuse injury questionnaire, whether they have any pain, whether their training volume is influenced, whether their performance is influenced as well. And we can see that the majority of the pain, or the ones with groin problems, actually do not have time loss. So only 10 to 30% will have a time loss injury. And if you go out and ask in your club, at any given week, around 10 to 20% of your team will have some form of groin problems. So where is it that we need to intervene? Are these players with pain or problems likely to develop groin pain? We would think so. So can we maybe detect these players at an earlier stage before they reach time loss? And there's a very simple test which was mentioned before as well. Just a simple 5-second squeeze have been shown to correlate very well with self-reported symptoms using the hip and groin outcome score. So we can see if we have the player just pushing the legs together in a deduction squeeze against the arm, and you just ask him, do you have pain from 0 to 10? So 0, no pain, and 10, maximum pain that they can imagine. And if they have 0 to 2 out of 10 pain, you can see on all the different Hager's questionnaire subscales, these are the different subscales, pain, symptoms, activities, daily life, sports and recreation, probably the most important, that they're actually quite normal. So even though they have this minimal pain, they look pretty good. So then we can say, okay, what do we want to do? Do we just want to let them continue? It's just a little bit of soreness. make a decision on that. But then when they reach 3 to 5 out of 10 in this test, we can see across all subscales that they are actually quite reduced. So this is 100 is a good score on this. And then on some of these subscales, they're below 70. So even though they're playing, they have 3 to 5 out of 10 in this test. It indicates that they're actually quite influenced during different activities. And when they're up at 6 to 10 during this test, they're really bad, and they probably should not be playing, even though they may be. There are other ways as well. It's getting more and more common to monitor strength on a more continuous basis. We've seen that this preseason test, adductor strength test, probably doesn't matter that much. So if we do it more continuously, we'll probably get a bit of a picture of the training status, which is, in my opinion, much more relevant than a once-off measure of strength and a categorization. So this, what is the training status, that can then give you an indication of what the capacity of this player is, rather than a once-off categorization of strength. So here's a study from Australia in regular football, where they did some adductor strength testing and Hager's questionnaires, and we can see that in the morning, if the players were tested in the morning, if they had reduced strength compared to the last strength test, reduced strength of more than 50%, or an adduction-abduction ratio of more than 90%, they were tested again in the afternoon. And so we always have to remember, there is some variability with the test. There is some test error that can just be related to the test and not to the actual strength. And then there's something with recovery involved in this as well. So if they look better in the afternoon, they're good, they can go out to soccer practice. But if they didn't, and they still had these reductions in strength, they will go in to do a clinical examination to determine whether or not these players need to go through a multimodal intervention, or they actually were injured and need to stop playing and do a proper rehabilitation program. So this is just one way of doing it, but it does not seem unreasonable to me to catch these players early and prevent these time loss injuries. What we can see again with these once-off measurements is that if you look throughout a season, here we got 22 months and a group of athletes, that even during the season, the pain will fluctuate. So it's really important also the time point that you're testing, which makes it more likely that you'll get more information from a continuous number of tests. So you get to these 3 out of 5 in your test. You did a quick screening test, and he has 3 to 5 out of 10 pain. Now you get the yellow light according to this approach. And then you need to start thinking about what is it that you really want to be doing. Now we need to, probably the first thing you want to be doing is modifying the load. Unfortunately, there's no evidence of the best ways to do this, and so it will have to be an individual discussion which will relate to the sport. And in football, it will relate to the team that you're in and the context of the player. And there's probably many different elements that will be reasonable to do before you actually take the player out for a period of time. There are some other things that research shows can give a minor effect. A simple approach of just getting some high compression shorts. So there's 2 RCTs on this. And we can see that putting on some high compression shorts can actually reduce adductor longus activation during change of direction movements. And it can also reduce pain. It is little, but it may be relevant for the player. On average, around 1 point on this 0 to 10 point scale, and an improvement around 10 points on the Hager subscales. And this is without any changes in performance on these standardized tests. Illinois agility test and some maximal kicking. So an easy way for a small win there. Then there's some manual treatment as well. It's not something that I use a lot in my general rehab program, but when you have players, they're often sore, they often feel this sensation of tightness. And in this study by Igor, who was talking earlier, they did a manual stretch where they go in and it's quite painful. Procedure, just pushing and stretching on the adductor longus, They did an adductor stretch, and they then told the players, yeah, you can return whenever you feel it at the level you feel like it. So it's uncertain which of these elements actually worked, but these players got continuously better and had quite a considerable reduction in pain over the first 2 weeks, which then continued to improve over the coming time. So not unreasonable in your day-to-day management as well, but of course not the only thing. All right, and then we get to the inciting event. When we get to players in and what's reported in the literature in these long-standing groin pain patients, we know that usually the two most common complaints in terms of injury situations is kicking and change of direction. So this is where you take your initial steps and consideration. And we can see we did a study on acute adductor longus injuries where we had players coming into us with an acute adductor longus injury. We then asked them what time in the match. We found the match and reviewed the match and the injury situation with them at the time, and they would tell us this was the exact time point where I felt my pain. And we can see that we could group this into change of direction, kicking, reaching injuries, so when you're stretching out, reaching for the ball, and jumping injuries. The commonality in this is that they have this diagonal pattern which we need to consider, at least in terms of the adductor injuries. Try to get here. So it's this diagonal pattern of hip extension, really important, your abduction and the external rotation. And that goes through both in kicking and in change of direction. Often when you go out, you have your push off and you get out to that stretch position. So it really gets a lot of load on the adductor longus. And the cause of that, as we heard before, can of course be lateral weakness, quad weakness, different places. But in the end, the victim often becomes the adductors, or at least the anterior groin region. So something that we have to consider in our interventions. And it's likely not that dissimilar in other sports which have a high amount of groin pain. We can see that these movements are often the typical complaint situations in sports with high amounts of groin pain. So the key point for this is that this movement really stretches the adductor longus, so we need to make sure that we have the capacity at length. So the capacity of withstanding load that it will go through for many different reasons, but increasing that capacity to withstand the load. So when we look in our model again, we can say, okay, we have some good tools to detect a susceptible player who may or not already be injured, but at least before the time loss. But do we really want to wait until we get to that point when we know that about half of our team will have some form of problems with the groin throughout a season, and we can already target the prevention from the beginning? And that's, of course, what's been done in research. Then it's usually always group prevention. Everybody has to do the same. And then that's the only way that we can systematically see if the intervention is working. So if we look at the systematic review here on prevention of groin pain from 2015 as well, an overview of the relevant studies, and on average we get only around 19% reduction in groin pain, which is not a lot. Which is not what you're hoping for when you're doing an intervention program. So the two best studies in this review was Mr. Holmick again with his 6 exercises. We see the squeezes going through. They had a 31% reduction in pain, which was not significant, but it did help. It is not extremely quick, but you will get an effect from that. Then another study on college football players where they just implemented the FIFA 11+. So it's a large RCT on college football, and they actually had a 40% lower groin injury rate. But what we can see from this graph here, these are the injuries, so the blue ones are the control and the yellow ones are the intervention, that we can see that this reduction in injuries goes across all of the different locations. So this is probably more related to just having a structured warm-up program actually can reduce injuries across the board. because when we look at the FIFA 11 Plus in isolation, they don't have any adductor exercises as well, which we think is a bit important. So we did a little study up in Norway, Joar Harøy, did 2 groups, so an RCT, where they compared the FIFA 11 Plus program in under-19 elite players. One group will do the Copenhagen adduction exercise, and one group will do the normal program. They will do the normal program and replace the Nordic hamstring with the Copenhagen adduction, so adding the adduction exercise, and the other group only did the normal program. And we can see that the ones with the adductor, the Copenhagen adduction exercise, increased their strength over 8 weeks by 9%, and that was through only 1 set 3 times a week. And the other interesting element is that during the FIFA 11 Plus, there was no change in adduction strength. So that indicates that we will get effect on that and may be relevant. So they developed an adductor strengthening program as well. Oh, sorry, here. I'll just show you the Copenhagen adduction exercise so we know which one we're talking about. Here we go, easy to do on the pitch. And what we can see, even though the lower leg is going up and down, you're mainly working the adductors of the upper leg. So you can see here that the pelvis is moving up and down, where we're getting into length of the upper adductor. And that one is working a lot harder than the lower leg, is what we showed in EMG studies in this. And so it's important, there are a lot of different compensation strategies. Make sure that they're in a complete line, that they're not flexing their hip or flexing their trunk, so you're actually getting the focus on the adductors and a high focus on the adductor longus as well. So using this exercise, they developed a large RCT with the football clubs up in Norway. Joar Harøy again and his PhD, where they had 35 teams. One was a control group, cluster randomized into a control group, and the other cluster into this adductor strengthening program, which was based on the Copenhagen adduction exercise. So everybody was supposed to do the Copenhagen adduction exercise, and the program in itself just allowed players who weren't able to do it due to pain or so on to do it at a lower level, so a shorter lever arm holding the knee, or it's just a side-lying adduction. Then during the preseason, the first 5 to 6 weeks, they would do 3 sessions per week, 1 set per side only. And then during the season, they would only do it once per week and 1 set per side. So it's not a lot of time put into this program, and only 1 exercise. And what we can see here, so the way that then monitor the outcome of groin problems was using the OSTRC Overuse Injury Questionnaire. So these are 4 different questions related to participation, volume, performance, and pain. And these were then grouped into no problems, any form of groin problems, or substantial groin problems. So no problems, they report no effect on any of these 4 areas. Groin problem was any effect on any of these areas, and a substantial groin problem was a moderate reduction in volume or performance. And what we can see from this study is that on average, the weekly prevalence was 30% in the intervention group and 21% in the control group. So a large reduction in groin problems in general. And what we can see from this graph here is the weeks, the 28 weeks that the study was carried out over in terms of the season. And the largest effect is here in the beginning, and then it kind of fades out a little bit. But this corresponds to an average of 41% risk reduction of groin problems during a full season in terms of weekly prevalence. And as Enda King just mentioned, is that the substantial groin problems was a lesser effect. It was non-significant and an 18% reduction, but also an effect on both time loss and non-time loss injuries. So just to finish off, this is the available evidence. I'm happy to talk about other approaches here in the discussion. But what we can see is that the only modifiable internal risk factor that we know of at the moment is adductor strength, but we can't really use it to detect individuals at risk. Then my recommendation is to, if you're working with football, choose a group prevention which will target the whole team, because half of the team will have some form of groin problems during this time. And then we've shown that adductor strengthening will reduce groin problems. It likely does have a larger effect on adductor-related groin pain. But the main focus is that we target the capacity at length as a base thing. And then you can start building on the different causes that may contribute to these athletes developing pain on top of that. But really start with targeting your whole team with a simple exercise, which may be the Copenhagen adduction, or if you have any other exercise that you would assume would increase the capacity at length. And then, if it doesn't go well, make sure that you monitor your players, detect the problems early so you can intervene at an early stage so you won't go into these time loss problems. So thank you very much. That was all for me. I want to thank everybody at the Sports Groin Pain Center and all the people that I've been working with.